Yeah. Well, thanks for coming back. Wow. Good to see you all here on a Saturday morning. I want to reiterate what we talked about yesterday, just in case there's some here who weren't able to come last night. I'm here to put information on the table. We're not going to ask for decision cards when you leave. You don't have to make your mind up today. You've got a lifetime to sort through these things and think about them. So I'm just trying to put some more information on the table that not everybody has, but that in my career of study and research, I've been able to learn something about, and I want to share it with you. I'm speaking from the vantage point of someone who takes the Bible very, very seriously. We talked about that last night. And probably many of you are in that category. You really want to know what Scripture says. And it's not always an easy task. And again, more information is always a helpful thing. Some of you are perhaps very skeptical about the Bible. And as Jim mentioned, it's important for you to understand that all Christians don't fit in the same little box. There are different ways to work through this stuff. And so in that sense, we want to be giving a good representation of some of the options that are out there. And so today we want to move our discussion from Genesis 1, as we did last night, to Genesis 2. Again, I remind you that I'm not coming at this information as a scientist. I'm not going to talk about evolution. I would not be the person to talk about evolution or non-evolution or the problems with evolution or the promotion of evolution. I'm not here to promote a scientific viewpoint. I want to talk about what the Bible's claims are, because that's what we need to understand. Again, we've been talking this weekend about, is there a war going on out there? And if there is, it has to do with conflicting claims. And if we're going to think there are conflicting claims, we need to make sure we understand the claims. And so we're going to take a look at Genesis 2. If you found last night to be a challenge to kind of new things to wrap your brain around, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But here we are, so let's do our best with it and continue our conversation as we move on to the issues of Genesis 2 and 3. Well, we have to start by talking about Adam. Now, if you're looking carefully at that top word, Adam, you notice there's a little hitch there, and that's because I'm representing that word as the transliteration of the Hebrew word, and that's part of that transliteration. Adam, of course, is a Hebrew word. It's not a Hebrew word that is intrinsically a person's name, although it can be a person's name, of course, but it's a larger word than that. It refers to humanity in general. And so when Genesis 1 talks about God created Adam, it's not God created Adam, it's Adam, and we know that because it says male and female, he created them. Adam is humanity, the human race. And that's what the Hebrew word means. Again, we want to try to understand it in its context. It occurs 34 times just in Genesis 1 through 5. And by the way, Adam is never mentioned again in the Old Testament, except in the genealogy in 1 Chronicles. So he doesn't become a person of major focus in the Old Testament, interestingly enough. In those 34 occurrences, some are without the definite article. Definite article is a grammatical term. In English, it just refers to the word the. It says it's not just a car, it's the car, definite article, okay? So sometimes in Genesis, it occurs without the definite article. Now, without the definite article, that could mean two different things. It could mean that it's not definite. It could also mean that it's a personal name, okay? Now, it's 5 times it is used as a personal name, very clearly in the context, but you can see it's kind of later on in Genesis 4 and 5. So in Genesis 5, when it's talking about Adam, who became the father of Seth, who became the father of, there it's using it as a personal name. But notice that even though it's referring to, therefore, a real person, and by the way, let me put that on the table right now. I'll repeat it several times. I do believe Adam is a real person in a real past. Okay? Not a made-up character, not fictional, not metaphorical, a real person in a real past. But we're going to have to unpack some of the details that surround that. But even as real people, these are not their real names. Eve did not call Adam, Adam. Oh, Adam, honey, could you come over here? Okay. Adam did not call Eve, Eve. Now you say, how do you know that? I know that because those are Hebrew words. And Hebrew did not develop as a language until the second millennium BC. And there was no Hebrew prior to that. And so whenever Adam and Eve lived, they weren't Hebrews. They're not Hebrews until you get kind of past Abraham and Jacob and Moses, and Hebrew language develops in the middle of the second millennium. So I don't know what their names were, what they called one another, but the names themselves have a quality to them. They have significance to them. This guy's called Human, and his wife is called Life. And whatever language they spoke, these are not their historical names, even though they're historical people. Now, I know, look what I've done. You're already reeling, okay? And we haven't even really gotten to the issues yet. But this comes in the whole process of trying to understand the text for what it is. Now, 4 times it's used as humanity, generically, en masse. I already mentioned Genesis 1:26. We can see that in several other places. So sometimes it's kind of a non-definite generic, humanity. Now, it also occurs most of the times in Genesis 2 and 3 with the definite article. The Adam, the human. And when it's got the definite article, we know it's not a personal name. We don't put definite articles on personal names. We don't in English. They didn't in Hebrew. In English, you've got the Donald. I know. Okay, never mind. Okay. That's an exception. Okay, so it occurs with the definite article, and that's all the way through Genesis 2 and 3. It's talking about the human. Okay, 20 times, arguably, it refers to an archetypal individual, which I'll explain in a little bit, so just hold that at bay. And 3 times with the preposition. That's a technical discussion. We're not going to get into it. So that's about the usage of the term. And see, already we're breaking down some presuppositions which we bring unintentionally to the text. This is another example of how we tend to read the text through our own preconceptions and presuppositions. When we read with our own culture and presuppositions in mind, we are imposing something on the text which may be foreign to the text. It's not always, but it may be. And so it's something we want to be careful about. We make assumptions. So, the next thing we have to look at is that the relationship between the 7-day account, and I'll just call that Genesis 1, even though we know that the 7th day is slotted into Genesis 2. Who did that? Anyway, chapter and verse divisions didn't come until Middle Ages, okay? So they weren't in the original texts. That's good to remember sometimes. Okay, so we want to look at the transitions. Okay, how does Genesis 2 relate to Genesis 1? Now again, most of you already have a presupposed assumption about that. It's very common, indeed you could call it traditional, to believe that Genesis 2 is a recapitulation of day 6. After all, if on day 6 it said God made people, and here he's making people, then this must be day 6. And so you assume that Genesis 2 is a recapitulation of day 6. That's certainly a possibility. There are other people today, mostly in the category of academics, scholars, often more critical scholars, who say the Bible's kind of a patchwork quilt, and Genesis 1 and 2 are really two competing, different traditions that have nothing to do with each other and actually are not in agreement with one another. That's a more skeptical view. It's a source view that Genesis 2 comes from one source and Genesis 1 comes from another source, and they are really in conflict. Well, that's another answer that people give about the relationship between these two chapters. What I would suggest is that if we can take a look at what evidence there is in the text itself for the relationship, that could be a helpful thing. And what I see that can be helpful for us is this literary introduction that we have in Genesis 2:4. Those of you who were here last night remember that I mentioned Genesis 1:1 was a literary introduction to that section. And now we have a literary introduction to chapter 2. This literary introduction follows the pattern of what we see throughout Genesis. 11 times Genesis has, "This is the account of." Depending what translation you use, it might say, "This is the story of," or "These are the generations of." That's the old King James reading of it. And this occurs 11 times through Genesis. It is the structuring element in Genesis. The author put it there. The author uses it to organize his information. So, if we've got this literary introduction between chapters 1 and 2, a fruitful exercise is to ask, what do we usually see in the relationship between what comes before the introduction and what comes after it? After all, we've got 11 of these in the book. We can take a look. And we can see the relationship between what comes before and after, because that's the question we have about Genesis 1 and 2. Well, there's the chart. Those are the other references that you can see there. And then in the second column, I've got a description of the relationship between those passages, and then the connection in the chart. Now, you can see then that the relationship column gives you basically two possibilities: sequel or recursion. Let me quickly explain what I mean by recursive. Okay? You can see that with Ishmael, like at 25:19, Ishmael to Isaac and Jacob. Okay, what's happening there? Well, it gives the genealogies of Ishmael. Of course, Isaac's brother gives the genealogy of Ishmael. And then it comes back after the introduction in 25:19. It comes back, and then it tells the Isaac story. Okay, so it's a recursion. It's not a sequel. Isaac doesn't come after Ishmael. But likewise, it's not a recapitulation. It's not retelling the story of Ishmael. So that one we call recursion. Tells Ishmael, but really Ishmael's not the main character here. So it comes back then, we're done with Ishmael, picks up Isaac, and then follows the story. Got the idea? Okay, so that's the recursion. Now you can see that happens a couple times, and it's always with brothers. So Jim and I, no, never mind. Okay, so that happens with brothers. All the rest are sequels. That means what you're doing after the introduction takes place after what came before the introduction. Sometimes more time has gone by, sometimes less time has gone by. But it's a sequel. Now, that doesn't prove anything about Genesis 1 and 2, but it suggests an alternative that maybe we hadn't thought about. And actually, it gives some evidence for that alternative, because we find the connection is never recapitulation. That doesn't mean it can't be recapitulation, but we ought to follow the patterns that we find. So none of these are recapitulative, and that means that would be a more difficult option to choose. I hope this isn't being tedious, but this is very important to set the stage for how we read the chapter. Obviously, if you think Genesis 2 is recapitulation of day 6, that's going to affect everything you read about the chapter. So it's really an important thing to think about. If it's a sequel, here's the kicker. If it's a sequel, then the people in Genesis 1 are not necessarily Adam and Eve. Genesis 1, God created people. It doesn't talk about Adam and Eve in Genesis 1. It doesn't say that there are just two. And if Adam and Eve, if we've got a sequel here, Adam and Eve somehow are later in the story. Now, that still leaves a lot of options. Adam and Eve could still be the people in Genesis 1 and 2, and this is just telling more of their story. Adam and Eve could be among a group created in Genesis 1 and 2. Or Adam and Eve could come later than the people in Genesis 1. Okay, so there are options on the table, and ones, therefore, that we could consider. Okay, so we're trying to think through. So what we're going to do for the integrity of our research, we're going to say, let's kind of cut Genesis 1 and 2 apart from one another. Let's just deal with Genesis 2 as it is. Consider the possibility of it being a sequel. Think about it. We'd say, well, I just can't figure out what it could mean. If Genesis 1 is not Adam and Eve, then why are they talking about Adam and Eve the way they do in Genesis 2? It doesn't make any sense to me. That's why you're here, so we can talk about those kinds of possibilities. Okay? One of the advantages right away is that the second account, Genesis 2, doesn't need to fit into day 6. That's been problematic in the past. Genesis 2 has a different sequence than Genesis 1. Okay, in Genesis 1, the animals come first, then people. In Genesis 2, people, and then God makes the animals and brings them to Adam and Eve. It's a different sequence. Genesis 2, you start out with, there are no plants around, and God makes people. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's not the same as Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, Adam's naming all the animals. Now, if you're of the 24-hour-a-day persuasion, that's problematic. Naming all the animals, and it's still day 6. I mean, a lot has happened before that. God plants a garden, and then Adam, and then we've still got Eve coming along. It's a pretty busy day. Sundown's coming, and he's still trying to name all the animals. 5,827 species of beetles. Man. And the sun's done with the Beatles. Send in the Rolling Stones. No, okay. Cultural embeddedness is such a fun thing. I mean, just Jim humming da-da-da-da-da-da, cultural illusions, and we pick it up. High context, low context, back to last night, right? Okay, so there are certain advantages to all of this. Furthermore, there are suggestions, hints at least in the Bible, that there are other people around. Cain finds a wife. I never liked the sister option there. Nothing against my sister who's sitting back there. Carol, it's all right. But, Cain finds a wife. Well, where does this come from? When Cain's driven away from the Lord, Cain says, whoa, now anybody that finds me is going to kill me. Mom and Dad? Who's he talking about? Dad's here too. Hi, thanks. Hi, Dad. Mom and Dad? Cain builds a city. You can't build a city for yourself. That's called a man cave. I don't know the Hebrew word. So there are hints that we have that there's more people around. Now, people have explanations for those, but they're difficult ones. And the fact is we face interpretive problems no matter which way we're going here. So, what's my proposal here? My proposal concerns archetypal functions. Last night we talked about functions, we talked about order, and how that was so important in the ancient world, how that was really the primary thing that intrigued them and that they wanted to talk about. And so here I want to propose that we have a text which focuses in part on archetypal functions. Precisely, specifically, I'm suggesting that everything in Genesis 2 regarding human origins is first and foremost archetypal. Now, notice I qualified that. I said regarding human origins. I didn't say regarding eating the fruit or regarding Adam and Eve having children. We have to judge on a case-by-case basis. But I'm suggesting that there's evidence, and we'll talk about it, that the issues regarding human origins are archetypal in nature. Now, by archetypal, I don't mean that they're just prototypes. It was kind of funny, when I first developed this terminology, I said, okay, I'm going to look in the dictionary and see what it's got there. And I looked up prototype and it said see archetype. I looked up archetype and said see prototype. They're not the same. The prototype is the first one off the assembly line. Okay, the prototype is, this is what the thing's going to look like, and now we're going to make them all. Archetype has a lot more going. Archetype involves an embodiment, that all of the rest are embodied in this one. So when we talk about everyone sinning in Adam, that's an archetypal type of statement. We're all embodied in Adam. In that sense, then, I'm not talking, for those literary types out there, I'm not talking about archetypal in the literary sense. In the literary sense, the archetype would be like the archetypal villain, Snidely Whiplash in Dudley Do-Right. That goes back a ways. Okay, we'll do something different than that. Saruman, okay. Yeah, so that the typical villain, the typical hero, the typical maiden in distress, okay, those are archetypes in literature. But again, in that sense, that archetype embodies kind of everybody who fits into that category. And some movies are distinctive because they break the archetypes. You can't really tell who's the villain and who's the good guy. Okay, so I'm not really using it that way either, although that's closer. Okay, so archetype has a sense of embodiment. Now, I'm suggesting then that the forming accounts, the human origins piece, the forming accounts are most relevant to Adam and Eve as archetypes rather than as individuals. Remember, I'm not suggesting that they are not individuals. I'm just saying the text is more interested in them as archetypes in this particular issue. Example, I was looking around for something on the internet a couple weeks ago, and a question was posed to second graders: what are mothers made of? Now already their mothers is an archetypal designation. Okay? Even though the second graders they talked to actually did have real individual, personal, historical mothers. Okay, still, this is dealing in the realm of archetype. And one little girl's answer was, mothers are made of angel wings and clouds and string and a little bit of mean. Now, she's talking about what mothers are. You wouldn't be inclined to go try to scope that out biologically. You know, which part's the angel wings? And so the discussion is archetypal, and her response, that little girl's response, was archetypal. She picked it up right away. And what she said in those ingredients said something about identity, what mothers are. That's what I'm talking about with archetypal. Now, how will we recognize whether something is archetypal or not when we're reading the text? I mean, obviously this is going to be an important decision. How would we know if it's talking about the individual or the archetype? There's my criteria. It's identified as archetypal if what they say refers to everyone, not just to the particular individuals. if the text gives us an indication that it's not saying something that is only true, uniquely true of that individual, but rather that it's identifying something that is true of all of us, then it would be archetypal. It's a pretty easy criteria, and it's doable. Okay? So again, that little girl wasn't just saying, well, my mother's made of angel wings and clouds. And so, no, this is mother's. Okay? That's basically the proposal. Now we have to see how it works out as we look at the evidence. Formed from dust. What do you automatically think of when you read that Adam, or that God formed Adam from the dust of the ground? Some people think about chemistry. We talked last night about the idea that some people are very eager to read scientific detail into the biblical text. And we noted that the problem with that is that ancient Israel doesn't really have science that's anything like ours. So when we start reading science, we're imposing meaning on a text that its author, who we consider authoritative, did not know, did not have. And anytime we start imposing meaning from the outside on the text, we risk distorting it. When I read it against the ancient Near East, I'm not imposing information from the outside. I'm trying to identify the information that was on the inside that we've lost because we're not in the ancient Near East. So some people think about chemistry, but that would immediately move outside of anything that the author would have known. The Israelite periodic table is very small. No, they don't even have one, yeah. Chemistry is not how they would think. Other people, and probably more commonly, would be inclined to think in terms of craftsmanship. Here's the image of God as the potter and the potter's wheel, and he takes and shapes the human being, getting his hands dirty. Does God have hands? If you think that way, you're already jumping to some very figurative, metaphorical kinds of things. But we're thinking craftsmanship. The major problem with craftsmanship is not the question of whether God has hands. The major problem with craftsmanship, as an alternative, is that the ingredient is dust. He could have said clay. That would have made sense. You can shape clay. You can't shape dust. And if craftsmanship and God getting his hands dirty in this molding of it, they would have used clay. As a matter of fact, in the ancient Near East, both in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, they do use clay, as in some of the traditions about human origins. But this does not. It uses dust. So, if it's not chemistry and it's not craftsmanship, what are our other alternatives? What is it? Well, we should look to the text to help us figure some things out, look at some possibilities. And we don't have to look far. We get to Genesis 3:19 and we find out, dust you are, and to dust you shall return. That suggests mortality. Now, the text is pretty clear on that connection. Dust connected to mortality, and it's not just in Genesis 3:19. You can find it in numerous other passages, Old Testament and New Testament. But we don't like it. We don't like it because we say, well, that would mean that people were created mortal, and I don't believe that. Well, let's look at the Bible. Why don't you believe that? Well, the answer comes, I don't believe that because Paul says that we are subject to death because of sin. And if we're subject to death because of sin, that would mean that before we sin, there wasn't death. So I'm going with Paul. Paul says, they would say, Paul says that people were created immortal. No, he doesn't. He says that we are subject to death because of sin. That's not the same thing as saying we were created immortal. Let's think back to Genesis for a moment. We'll come back to Paul in a second. I'm going to leave most of the Paul discussion to Dr. Evans, but we have to make this one point here. But let's go back for a minute. Adam and Eve, right, are in a garden, and there are trees. You remember the trees? Okay, one of them is a wisdom tree, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the other one is a tree of life. Immortal people don't need a tree of life. It's redundant. It's irrelevant. If they have life, they don't need life. Sinking in? Immortal people don't need a tree of life. Well, so what's the tree of life doing here? Well, the text has told us that he's made from dust. And the text has told us that dust is connected to mortality. That suggests that he is created mortal, and that would certainly explain why a tree of life is an important and necessary thing. That suggests that having been created mortal, that God is also providing a remedy, an antidote. That is, you are mortal, but life is available. Life is available not just from a magical fruit, but life is available in relationship with God, who has provided a means for life. Life is always connected to relationship with God. God is the source of life. If he chooses to use a tree with fruit, that's fine, but don't mistake it. God is the source of life. So life is available to them in their mortality. When they disobeyed, when they tried to be like God, God kicked them out of the garden and set up a guardian, the guardian cherub. By the way, that's not the little pudgy guys with wings, Cherub is a fearsome beast in the ancient world. A guardian to the tree of life. So as a result, because of sin, they were kicked out of the garden, and without access to the tree of life, they're subject to death. And we're back to Paul. We are subject to death because of sin. Because with sin, we lost the antidote. With sin, we lost the remedy. With sin, we lost the relationship to God that could bring life. And with sin, we are subject to the death that we were created in. Paul doesn't say that people were created immortal. We are subject to death because of sin. Now, that brings us back to dust then. Dust is connected then to mortality. And so we have to ask the question, is this something that is only true of Adam, uniquely true of Adam, or is it true of everyone? Right? We're asking our archetype versus individual question. Well, let's take a look at Psalm 103:14. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. Is there any question in anybody's mind? He's referring back to Genesis 2. I mean, we've got formed, we've got dust. This is what we're talking about. But there's something very, very important here that we can read over very easily and not notice the significance of, and that is, whoa, this little word, we. We are dust. It includes us all in the concept. Every human being is formed of dust. You and I, everyone, we're all formed from dust. That is not something unique to Adam. It's something that's true of all of us. The Bible tells us this. The first man is of dust, and all are from dust. That's Paul. Now, if we accept the Bible's word on this and say that, yes, indeed, we are all formed from dust, we start to notice something very important. You are all formed from dust, yet you were born of woman. You're both. Formed from dust, born of woman. Being formed from dust, therefore, does not describe your material formation. And it doesn't describe Adam's material formation. That's not the kind of statement it is. Being formed from dust would not preclude being born of a woman. You are all testimony to that. Being formed from dust, therefore, does not describe your material origins, and there's no reason to read it as describing Adam's material origins. It's not that kind of statement. It's an angel wings and clouds kind of statement. It doesn't pertain to material origin, it pertains to identity. The same way that angel wings and clouds pertain to identity. This is what mothers are. This is what humans, Adam, humanity, this is what we are. We're mortal, we're frail. It's intended to communicate indeed what all humans are, not just what Adam uniquely is. That's really an important distinction. Because if we're going to the Bible to try to get a science, which remember last night I said it's not revealing science, but we're going to try to get a science of material, biological, human origins, this is not going to give us a claim that's helpful to us. So, how about woman? How about woman? Okay, now, what have we got here? Does Adam believe that Eve was created from his rib? No. You're saying, come on, how do you know that? The way I know most things in this conversation, I know it if the Bible tells me so. And the Bible does give you information on this. What are the first words out of Adam's mouth? This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. There's more than a rib going on here, folks. Adam himself identifies. This is the text. It identifies bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Well, you might say, then why does my translation translate it as rib? Some of your translations, by the way, if you look down in the margin, it says side. And in fact, that's got a lot to speak for it. In the Bible, this term, okay, wait a second. Before I even get to that, let's take a look at all the places in the Bible where this term, okay, describes anatomy, something anatomical. Okay, we're done. There's only one. This is it. This is the only place where it's anatomical. All the other places, it's architectural or locational. This side of the temple, that side of the temple, north side of the altar, south side of the altar. It's locational or architectural. And it pertains to a side, and typically one side when there are two. If God took one of Adam's sides, that's one of the two that he's got. Cracked in half. Better half, I assume, is used to make Eve. That's fairly major surgery. But why should we think in terms of surgery? We're reading an ancient text. Well, it says God closed up the flesh. That's still far from saying this is a surgical procedure. Well, God puts him in a deep sleep. Really? Do Israelites understand anesthesia? See how we impose our modern categories and ideas on a text? But back to the word for a moment before we follow that one. In Aramaic, the earliest translations into Aramaic from Hebrew, in the Septuagint, which are the Greek translations, even in the Vulgate, they're all ambiguous about this, rib or side, and they actually have the conversations. A rabbi back in the 3rd, 4th century is already trying to argue that it's side, not rib. So this conversation's actually been around a long time, just it doesn't circulate much today. So what's going on then? If it's not anesthesia, if we're not talking about surgery, what are we talking about? We have to look at the language again. Adam is put into a deep sleep. Okay, the Hebrew word's tadema. It occurs about 15 times, half of them verbally, half of them as noun. And we can look at those and kind of see what's involved. We find that there are two basic ways, contexts, we should say, in which a deep sleep occurs. The first of them is a situation where there is danger and the person's unaware of it. So Jonah, in a deep sleep in the bottom of the boat while the storm's going on, okay? And the ship's thinking about breaking up, although breaking up is hard to do. And Jonah is totally unaware of the danger that is facing him. He's in a deep sleep. Saul is in a deep sleep when David creeps into his camp. As a matter of fact, the whole camp, God put them into a deep sleep. And David and his men creep right to the middle of the camp where Saul's laying there with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. And David's really tempted to just kind of change its location by a few inches. Deep sleep, unaware of the danger. Sisera, the leader of the Canaanites, fighting with Deborah and Barak, Judges chapters 4 and 5. Okay, and he's being defeated in battle. He flees to the tent of someone who he thinks is an ally, not so much, but the tent of Hever and Yael. Hever's out, and Yael, his wife, is there, and she gives him some nice warm milk and covers him with a nice warm blanket and soothes him to sleep, and then takes a tent peg and a hammer and let's just say it's another temple story. Okay, so, come on, stick with me. Okay. Deep sleep because there is danger looming. Now, we really don't want that to work in this passage. Woman's coming, there's danger! Okay, that's probably not, we don't get an idea that that's the sense here. Remember, she's made as his helper, not as a threat to him. Well, what's the other way? The other way this term is used is when it's preceding a visionary experience. A visionary state where the person is unresponsive to the human world and correspondingly responsive to communication from the divine realm. Our best example is Abraham in Genesis 15. That's the ratification of the covenant. He cuts the animals in half, and then he's in a deep sleep. And in that, he sees a vision with a torch and the incense passing through the parts of the animals, and the covenant is ratified. I would suggest a fairly significant spiritual theological moment in the history of the world. And it's unfolded in a vision. Daniel in chapter 9 and 10, Eliphaz, Job 4, a visionary experience. Now, that suits this context very well. That is, Adam is in a deep sleep, and in that deep sleep, he is shown something significant. Remember, he's been naming the animals. What's he naming the animals for? He's not looking through the animals to try to find someone to be fruitful and multiply with. Ooh, that's scary, not going there. He's not looking through the animals because he's in the Lonely Hearts Club and he doesn't need someone to be with. I need a pet. He's looking through the animals because he's been given a task and he's looking for a helper in that task. We'll come to that, back to that in a minute. But what he sees in this vision is himself being cut in half and made into two. And he says, now this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This is my equal partner. This is who I am, reduplicated. And that's the kind of helper. The technical term for this would be that she's his ontological equal. Ontology meaning of the same nature and being, the same essence, okay? She's his ontological equal. The animals were not. And so he recognizes she's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This one at last. She's drawn from me. We're the same. Now, Septuagint, again, uses ecstasis for this sleep. You might recognize in that the root ecstasy. It's not exactly the same in English and Greek, but you get the drift, okay? Vulgate, sopor, and as early as Tertullian, we have this concept of him being in a deep sleep. So again, this is something that's been recognized in church history, but we don't hear much about it today. So the idea that what's happening in this regard to the woman, it's not giving us an account of her material origins if it's happening in a vision. It's not surgical, it's visionary. It's not biology, it's ontology, it's identity. Now, the text itself indicates this to us. Very next verse, one you're very familiar with. That is why. Adam's just said, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Okay? That concept, this ontological connectedness, she's me, I'm her, that identity, that is why a man leaves his father and mother. Israel's a clan society. Everyone in the ancient world was a clan society. And therefore, your clan is your identity. So why would you have this thing called marriage taking place where people from different clans hook up? Your identity was your clan. And this is saying there's something more central to identity. Your human identity is built into this male-female thing. And that's why you would leave your clan identity in some senses. You leave your father and mother, united to your wife, and the two become one flesh. And in this context, we should certainly understand that as again. They were one flesh cut in two. and they become one flesh again. And because of our culture and who we are and what we think this has to do with sex. Don't we think everything has to do with sex? This isn't about sex. This is about identity, human identity, and how male and female are the two really inseparable parts of human identity. That's what humanity is, male and female. Now, what's this role they're going to serve in together? Genesis 2:15 tells us, and by the way, just before I get into this, this archetypal idea, you can see that I've been working simply in the biblical text and trying to demonstrate from the biblical text the meanings of words. But I can tell you that every account in the ancient Near East that talks about human origins is archetypal. They always talk about certain ingredients. As the gods are making people, and it's usually people en masse, and the gods are making them, and they identify ingredients. And the ingredients differ from one tradition to another. Sometimes it's clay. Sometimes it's the blood of a god. Sometimes it's the spit of a god. Sometimes it's the tears of a god. They all deal with ingredients. And the ingredients are always archetypal in nature. In all of these cases, they're not talking biology. They're talking identity. It's an angel wings and clouds kind of conversation. What is it that people are? And so we can see that even though I've developed this data from the biblical text, that it's informed by the wide breadth of ancient Near Eastern literature, again showing us that the Israelites are embedded in their world. The conversations take place in that context, not in a modern scientific context. The biblical claims then are related to the words they use and the way they're thinking about these ideas. That's how we find the biblical claims, and it's the biblical claims that have authority, not what we read into them. So, what is this task? Why was it not good for Adam to be alone? Why does he go looking among the animals? How does he see Eve as helping out? Well, what's going on with it? We get our information in the biblical text from Genesis 2:15. We've read it as to serve and keep. Serve and take care of. Work and take care of. All kinds of different translations, depending which one you happen to look at. What is the nature of this task? This is what God has given Adam to do. God put Adam in the garden in order to blank and blank. Now, it's our natural inclination, again, here I'm contrasting our culture to theirs, it's our natural inclination for us to think that he's doing gardening work. Landscaping, planting, harvesting, gardening work. And as a matter of fact, there would be some basis for that. Back up in chapter 2, verse 5, it says, there is no man to work the ground. That verb work is the same as the first one here that's represented here as serve. Okay, so it can refer to kind of working the ground, agricultural activity, but only when it's got the word ground as its direct object. We find also that this same verb is used throughout the Bible to refer to any kind of labor that you do. Okay, it's the labor that you shouldn't do on the Sabbath. It's the work of administrators in a king's cabinet. And it's also the word for slaves. From king's administrators all the way down to slaves, the whole range of culture, this is a general kind of word. And therefore you have to get its focus from context. We find also that it most frequently, in the first 5 books of the Bible, most frequently describes the work of priests in the temple, the work of priests in sacred space. So, when this verse says you are to serve it, it's got a direct object on it, referring presumably to the garden. Okay, then you have to ask the question, if he's serving it, the garden, not working ground, serving garden, then that activity is going to be determined by what the garden is. If you only think of the garden as green space, nice, city park, wonderful place to hang out and get some rays, well, place growing fruit and vegetables, what do we think the garden is? We might have all sorts of presuppositions about that, but the fact is the Bible helps us understand what the garden is. The garden is sacred space. God's there. If God's there, it's sacred space. Eden is sacred space. Now, in the ancient world, we find that they typically plant gardens in conjunction with sacred space, because that's an indicator of God's blessing and fertility. And so, gardens next to sacred space, everybody knows that in the ancient world. An Israelite reading this garden when God is there, no surprises. That's what gardens were doing in sacred space. So they are to serve sacred space. That's what the garden is in the text. This is not landscaping. Let's make this bush look like a beaver. Okay? It's not landscaping. It's tending, serving, like the priests do, in sacred space. Now, if you had any questions about that in the first verb, it should be resolved in the second verb, because that second verb does not pertain to gardening. It pertains to sacred space. They preserve, protect, guard the sacredness of sacred space. This is what priests do. We often think in the Bible, priests are the ones who offer sacrifices. Oh, that's just a little tiny sliver of what priests do. Priests are there to serve in sacred space and to preserve sacred space. God is going to create sacred space among Israel, the tabernacle, the temple. And so he tells them they are a kingdom of priests, because they are the guardians, the safekeepers of that sacred space. They're not a nation of priests for the other nations, meaning they're offering sacrifices for them. They don't. But the whole nation of Israel has been given the task of guarding sacred space. And that's what task Adam has been given, a priestly role in sacred space. Big job, need help. Trying to imagine what the entry in the newspaper would have looked like. Never mind. Okay. So, Eve has been designated. Adam needs a helpmeet. Boy, what a weird English word that is. It's not one we use for anything else, and we really don't know what's going on here. Eve is to help Adam in a sacred task. The main concept here with the Hebrew terminology is an ally. A helper is not an inferior. The one most commonly designated as helper in the Bible is God. So we know helper is not inferior. That doesn't mean woman's God either. Sorry about that. Okay? But it's an ally. So they're allies in this sacred task. As priests, they are representatives. That's what priests do. They represent in sacred space. The priestly representation is different from the archetypal representation. And then we already talked about the priests as Israel is a kingdom of priests, mediating knowledge of God and access to God's presence. So if we ask the question, why are Adam and Eve singled out here in Genesis chapter 2? It's not necessarily because they're the first humans and this is day 6. It's rather giving a sense of human identity. You are mortal. You are male and female. You are serving in sacred space because God has chosen to dwell among his people. That's the point of chapter 2. Priestly roles in sacred space. Adam and Eve then are select for that role. And God reveals to them important truth about their identity. Are they selected from other human beings? If so, they represent them in sacred space. Are they the only two? If so, I guess they're going to represent others that come along. But they're priestly representatives in sacred space. So, if the details of forming, dust rib, if the details of forming apply to them as archetypes, then we have no information about material origins. We have no information about them being formed as individuals. Just like when we say you are formed from dust, doesn't really give me much information about your material, biological origins. Archetypal identity does not negate the existence of the individual. Hear me clearly. They are individuals. I've got no problem with that. Real people in a real past. But you don't have to tell that story. There's a bigger story to tell about human identity. The appropriate question then is not, is this what really happened biologically, historically, chronologically? The real question is this really who we are? Dust? Gendered? Yes. Yes, it is. And to affirm that doesn't make any claim about human origins. It was good. Again, Adam and Eve then, they're part of what is good. But that's not the same as perfection. We talked about that last night. They're functioning properly in their roles in an ordered system. In the first account, Genesis 1, the cosmic temple was good. The second account, the human role in sacred space is not good until Eve comes along. Whatever order God establishes was good. Okay? And I'm going to have to skip a couple slides here because I'm running out of time. So my apologies for just running through this. Maybe that'll come up. Okay, so how should we think? Let's land the plane here. Okay? As we circled Buffalo yesterday coming in late, I was hoping they would land the plane. Okay, let's land the plane. The importance of recognizing biblical claims. You can see that I'm trying to do a very, very, very close reading of the text. I'm not trying to make it something it's not. I don't want to turn something that's meant at one level into something metaphorical or symbolical or figurative on another level. I'm trying to read the text as an Israelite in an ancient world would have read it. Not everyone's going to agree with this interpretation. I'm fine with that. There's no interpretation everybody's going to agree with. What we have to ask is, are we being faithful interpreters? We all know that there are many very important theological issues that Christians have differences of opinion about. I don't need to go through the list. You can come up with a dozen yourself that fast. And people don't all agree on very important theological issues. But we look at what people do and we say, are they being faithful interpreters to the text? And if they are, we welcome them as brothers and sisters in Christ, even though we have differences of opinion in interpretation. The acceptance of science does not then require the rejection of the Bible or of faith. If somebody is persuaded by an evolutionary model, I can't stand there thumping my Bible and saying, no, you've departed from the Bible. You've rejected the plain truth of Genesis chapter 2. I wouldn't be able to do that because I don't see Genesis 2 as making any claims against evolution. That's not a statement that evolution is correct. Evolutionary scientists are changing their understanding all the time. Although we still, as Christians, often categorize evolution if it's something from the 1920s and shortly after Darwin kind of period. Evolutionary science is changing radically, and we often misrepresent it. But my point is not to say, gee, you ought to accept that scientific proposal. I can't keep up with all the things that are going on. I can only ask the question, does the Bible leave room for that? Does the Bible make claims that are contrary? If it doesn't, well then you can look at the science as science and make up your mind. Now I find it fascinating that so often in blogs and reviews and the press they say, Walton only cares about making the Bible agree with science. Don't they listen to what I say? The science is insignificant to me. The Bible is everything. Just because I believe that the Bible does not rule out an evolutionary model doesn't mean I've embraced an evolutionary model and doesn't mean that I was motivated to try to make it all okay. I'm motivated to read the Bible well. So, acceptance of scientific models, whatever shape they might have, here is not conflicting with the biblical claims. If the Bible makes no claims about biological, material, human origins, then no science can possibly conflict with them. Unless science says there's no God, but that's something different altogether. That's a different discussion. Let me leave you with a thought. God has made us more than what he made us from. And I don't care what you think he made us from. If you think he made us straight from dust, this is true. If you think that we came through a string of primates, this is true. If you think we came from amino acids in a primordial soup, this is true. And this is the core truth. This is the biblical truth. God has made us more than what we came from. This is God's thing. He does this. Israel, your father was a wandering Aramean, Deuteronomy 23. Ezekiel 16, your father was an Amorite, your mother was a Hittite. But God selected Israel and made them more than what they are made from. And it's not important what they were from. It's important what God has made them to be. God has made us more than whatever we came from. We're not just dust. We're not just primates. We're not just a combination of cells. God has made us more. That's the biblical truth. And that's true of our identity in Christ. Some of you were murderers and adulterers, Paul says. Some of you were liars and thieves. But God took you out of that. And what you were doesn't matter. What God has made you to be is what matters. And you are a new creation. You are a new person in Christ. And who you are in Christ is your identity. God has given you a new identity. The Bible is much more interested in identity than it is in origins.